Welcome to the second episode of the Tyrone History Podcast with host Cooper Spicer and special guest Dustin. Today we'll talk about forgotten Civil War hero and Commander James Crowther. How are you doing, Mr. Elder?
I'm doing really well. I'm excited to talk about this topic. It's one of my favorite parts of Tyrone history that most people don't know anything about.
All right. First of all, who is James Crowther?
That's a really good question. So he was born in 1818, so we're going to go way back in time. 1818 is before Tyrone was even a place. And James Crowther is born and very early on moves to Center County, so just north of us. Grows up in Penns Valley and works on a farm, as most people did in this area at that time, and continues his life as a farmer. In his 20s, he gets married, and he and his wife will have 3 kids that survive to adulthood. In that time period, it was very common to lose kids every once in a while to diseases and illnesses and accidents. And so Crowther has a family, and he's working as a farmer. He very quickly realizes that his talents are in business, and so he decides to take his family from Penns Valley and move all the way to Clearfield County to Curwensville. And in Curwensville, he'll open up a business that was very important at the time that we don't hear a lot about today, but the business was a livery business. So, Cooper, do you know what a livery business is?
No, I have no clue.
Yeah, so every town in America really at that time that was growing would have a livery. And so if you were traveling from town to town before the invention of automobiles, you had horses. And you think like the old Western movies, you just tie your horse up outside the saloon and go into the saloon or whatever. What if you were staying in Tyrone for like 3 days? You can't just like tie your horse up outside and let it there for 3 days, right? You have to feed it and you have to take care of it. And that's where a livery comes in. So you'd ride into town and you can store your horse in the livery. Also, if you didn't have a horse, you could rent a horse from a livery, or you could pay to have the horse the livery business take you somewhere else, right? They could take you to another space. And so Crowther opens up a livery business. He buys a couple horses. He builds a nice store in Curwensville. And for several years, he lives there before moving to this brand new shiny town right here in central Pennsylvania called Tyrone City. All right, 1851, Tyrone City is established as a community. It won't be incorporated as a town until 1857. He moves here sometime around 1857, so he would have probably called it Tyrone City when he came here. We dropped the city in 1857 when we signed and made ourselves an official town. So we become Tyrone in 1857, and Crowther is here. He moves his livery business from Clearfield all the way down to Tyrone and builds a structure on what was then Logan Street today. You can kind of think of it as like behind the armory, next to the Juniata River. That's roughly where he would have been and had his little business with his horses, and his family would have lived either above it or nearby. And he and his kids, that was the idea. They were all going to work there. Crowther was really engaged in his community as well, so he joined a local militia, which was very common at the time for men to join a militia group where they would kind of work on military drills and practice shooting and practice horseback riding. He joins that, very quickly raises the ranks there, and becomes kind of the head of our local artillery unit. And then he's elected mayor of Tyrone. He's the 3rd mayor in Tyrone in 1860, and then that leads us to the Civil War. In 1861, it kicks off.
Okay. When he was in the Union Army, what did he do to rise through the ranks and eventually become commander?
So it's a really kind of long story, and when you think about the Civil War and you learn about it in school, most of the time you just go like causes of the Civil War, and then you go battle to battle to battle to battle to battle, and then it's like, it's over. We won, right? At least us here in Pennsylvania, we're like, we won. What you really need to think about when you think about like a person in the Civil War is like how much time they spend not in battles and what they're doing when they're not fighting, right? So in 1861, Fort Sumter is attacked by the South. We lose Fort Sumter, South Carolina secedes. It becomes this whole like, the Civil War kicks off, right? Crowther answers Abraham Lincoln's call. Abraham Lincoln asked for 75,000 troops to serve for 3 months. They're called 90-day men. And local militias really just sent people. So Crowther answers that call, and that's how he first enters the Civil War. He takes a train, most likely to Harrisburg, and then from there, they're going to be formed into different units. They kind of combine local militias and make a military. And he is given a position that's in charge of a regiment, so like a captain, but he's not in charge. He's not a lieutenant colonel, which is where he'll end. He'll end as a full-fledged colonel in the Civil War. But at the start, he's just a company commander, so he's in charge of about 100 guys. He's 43 years old at the time, so he's a lot older than the average soldier in the Civil War, which is probably one of the reasons why he was elected captain of his regiment. That's typically what those regiments would do. They would just kind of like pick someone, and they'd be like, oh, you're the best, like you be that. He serves for 90 days. They don't see a lot of action. They get close to some of that early action in the Civil War, but he doesn't actually see any action. And so when his 90 days are up, he has to face a big choice. Does he go home to his family? I mean, think about it if you were there, right? If it was your family, it's like your dad is serving in the army, and he has to decide, is he going to come home back to the family, or is he going to re-enlist? And if you re-enlist, most people got a promotion, which meant he would be able to send more money home, but at the cost of he's got to serve in the army. And so Crowther makes the decision to re-enlist, and when you re-enlist, sometimes you're reassigned to different units, and that's where Crowther is positioned with his most recognizable unit, which is the 110th Pennsylvania Volunteers. So the 110th PA, he is listed as the major, which is just below the person in charge of the entire regiment. A regiment would have anywhere between 500 and 1,000 guys, and so he's the second in command. The 110th Pennsylvania is kind of crazy in that half of it is good old Central PA boys, Blair County, Huntington County, Clearfield County, a lot of like us. The other half of the unit are from Philadelphia, so like the city of Philadelphia. A lot of younger guys that were drafted. And so you have half the guys from the mountains of Pennsylvania who have never seen a city before in their lives. And then you have the other half from Philadelphia who have never seen farm fields like we have here. And they just kind of smash them together, and they're like, there you go, the 110th Pennsylvania. And by all accounts, it goes terrible. They are like the most dysfunctional unit. Their commander is a guy who has goals of becoming a politician. And so that's the only reason he joined. He didn't care about service, and he didn't care about necessarily like doing well in battle. All he wanted to do was like get his name in the paper so that people would then vote for him someday. Crowther's the opposite. He's like, I want to do this. I want to, save the Union. We want to win the war. So there's some tension there with the leadership. You have tension with the guys. There's at one point they get reprimanded by the general of the Army of the Potomac because they actually get into like this. They start this big brawl because the city boys and the country boys aren't getting along very well. And over time, the unit starts to drill, and they see combat, and it just slowly evolves, and they start to come together. It's kind of like a movie. It's like Remember the Titans, right? They kind of come together and become this cohesive unit, but it takes like 2 years for them to like figure it out. And so most of the time in that 2 years, it's a lot of like sitting around. James Crowther writes letters home all the time to his family and receives letters. And in his letters, he's like, hi, how's the business? How's Tyrone? What are people doing? What's my son doing? Is my son still messing around with this bad crowd? What's Bill doing? Bill is one of his kids. Is he being a good boy? Tell him to sell this horse. I just received a letter from this guy. Like, that's what he's doing most of the time. They're like, oh, we're marching to Virginia. It's going to take a couple days. I'll send you a letter when I get there. That's most of the war. So like when you think about the war, the Civil War, instead of going battle to battle to battle, it's really like these guys don't know when they're going to fight. So they're like, we're marching here. We're going to cross this big river. That's going to be tough. We're probably going to have to camp out on both sides of it for like a week until we cross it. Oh, they're sending us back to D.C., so we don't know what we're going to do there. And slowly, you make your way through the war until kind of getting into your question of when did he become like the commander? How did he get that station? The head of his regiment, the 110th Pennsylvania, got sick. His name was William Lewis. He got sick, the political guy. And then he went home for a while and then just ended up not coming back. and just got a medical discharge from the military. And so everybody gets to go up a peg. And so Crowther, who was a major, then becomes a lieutenant colonel. And he is in charge of the whole 110th Pennsylvania. And that, unfortunately for Crowther, is right when the 110th Pennsylvania is going to go into some of the heaviest fighting that they'll ever do in the Civil War, like about a month ahead of time before the big battle that they're very famous in. He's placed in charge.
Speaking of those battles, what were some of the most famous battles he was involved in?
Sure. So the first real action that he writes home about and talks about is a smaller battle. You have to be kind of a Civil War buff to know about it, but it's the Battle of Kernstown. And so it's a smaller engagement. It's not like the size of Gettysburg, obviously. Being in Pennsylvania, we've heard of that one. Or the one I'm going to talk about in a second, Chancellorsville. But Kernstown's the first place they see action, and by most accounts, they perform really, really well. So the men do an awesome job. They get shot at quite a bit. They don't fall apart. They don't run away. They stay in formation. They fight back effectively. And it's really kind of their birth and fire. They're going to have to see how they perform. And now we know that they're a very strong unit. Even though they had some of those early troubles with each other, they've really grown up. And under Crowther, under his leadership, they are very straight and narrow. So they had rules within the unit: no drinking. They had to say their prayers every day. They had curfews at night. Crowther didn't want to see anybody out in the fields, like just having a good time. He's like, we are here. It's all business, and that paid off in the Battle of Kernstown. He wrote a letter back to his daughter Allie, and in the letter he said, "My dearest, sweet Allie, you would never guess what happened. Your papa had bullets shot at him. He could hear the bullets whistling past his ears. He could hear the bullets flying over his head. My surcoat has a hole in it. I got shot through the coat." So he didn't get hit, very narrowly. But the Union do really well in that battle, and Crowther performs really well. And that's leading into the biggest battle of his career, which is Chancellorsville. And so Chancellorsville is a massive battle. It's one of the biggest battles of the Civil War. It's considered General Robert E. Lee's greatest victory, so that's not good for us, right? If the battle is really known for being the South's big win, that's not good for us in the North. And Crowther, obviously, being the 110th Pennsylvania, we are in the thick of it. It's a tough one for us. If you don't know anything about Chancellorsville, like super brief summary, the Union Army was moving down into Virginia. Fredericksburg, Virginia's here, and then you have Chancellorsville. We moved down into position and try to take that town and catch Robert E. Lee, kind of split. And Robert E. Lee does something crazy. Instead of like running away, he splits his army and tries to surround us, and no one expected that. And it didn't have a very big chance of working. But obviously, historically speaking, it does work, and that's why it's known as his best victory. But when he split his army, they attacked Chancellorsville on either side, and the whole point of Robert E. Lee's plan was to connect his armies. That's like his goal. We have to connect our armies, and we're going to connect them at one specific spot, and that spot is now today known as Hazel Grove, just outside of Chancellorsville, just south of the city. And guess where James Crowther and the 110th Pennsylvania was positioned?
Hazel Grove.
Yeah, they were parked right in Hazel Grove. So the battle is several days long. It kind of ebbs and flows, and troops kind of move around. But the head of the battle is about May 3rd in the morning. It kicks off at about sunrise. James Crowther and the 110th Pennsylvania are positioned in this big open space called Hazel Grove. It was a plantation, and the Confederates are on either side trying to connect there at Hazel Grove. And there's another unit called the 84th Pennsylvania that's right beside the 110th. Crowther is placed in charge of that regiment as well. So our boy James Crowther is in charge of like a little over 1,000 guys right there in the middle of Hazel Grove, the most important spot on the battlefield. And unfortunately, that's going to be where like the bulk of the action is on May 3rd. That's where the Confederates are going to focus all of their cannons and all of their infantry. They're going to really try to hammer Hazel Grove, and we are going to try to hold it. That's the idea. They thought Crowther's last orders were to hold that position as long as possible and only retreat if absolutely necessary. And so Crowther's like, okay, we're going to hold this spot. We're going to position ourselves. There was a Union battery, a cannon, a couple cannons up top on Hazel Grove, and they're going to hold this. They're going to hold off the entire Confederate army. Battle, like I said, kicks off right about sunup, and it's not good for us. It's a bloodbath. We are getting, it's what's called enfilading fire. It's coming from all sides. We are very quickly in trouble, and Crowther knows it, but he is to hold on for as long as he can. Unbeknownst to Crowther, as the Confederates kind of close in on their position in Hazel Grove, the rest of the units on either side of Crowther retreat. So the 84th and the 110th are sitting on this little open spot, and the people on the other side of him, on the other side of a wood line, they backed up. And the people on the other side, they backed up. And so now Crowther and the Blair County boys and some of those Philly boys, they're stuck. We're out in the middle of a field, and that's exactly where everybody's coming. And so Crowther is at one point in the battle, the Confederates about 50 yards away, and someone shouts out, according to one of the company commanders, his after-battle report said that at one point in the battle we were offered surrender. So the Confederates shouted out, hey, just lay down your guns. You're all by yourself out here. Crowther either he didn't believe it or he thought he was in a better position, but he answered that guy's call with an order to his men to fix bayonets and prepare for hand-to-hand combat. And so they prepared, they got ready. They put their bayonets on the tops of their guns, and they were gonna fight it out. And that didn't last very long. The Confederates overwhelmed Crowther's position, and he realized, obviously too late, we got to pull back. We've got to get our guys out of here and try to save as many as we can. And Crowther was really kind of a lead from the front kind of guy. So if he ordered a retreat, he was going to be the last guy off the field, right? He was going to say, Cooper, you go. I'm going to make sure everybody's off the field orderly. We're not going to just run away screaming, right? We're going to march off the battlefield. We're going to back up, try to keep firing to hold them back. And by the only account that we have of what happens here is that Crowther is one of the last guys off the battlefield, and he turns, and when he turns to leave the field, a bullet strikes him under his right breast, under his right chest. And he looks at the lieutenant beside him, and he says, help me, carry me off the field, stay with me. And his last words were, stay with me, to his lieutenant. And his lieutenant could not stay with him because they were retreating. And so he kind of stumbled and fell to the ground, and the lieutenant tried to pick him up, and he was mortally wounded. And so unfortunately, the lieutenant actually wrote a report about this and said, I tried to pick up his sword. I tried to pick up Colonel Crowther. He's a big guy. He was 6'1", which is bigger than the average guy. He was probably over 200 pounds. He's like farmer strong, right? He's a big guy. He's like, I tried to pick him up, and I couldn't get him off the field. So I had to leave him, and we had to get off the field. A bunch of the 110th are captured or killed, over half of them. They lose half of their force in this one single attack in one morning within an hour. It's really sad because obviously Crowther dies on the battlefield. He gave the ultimate sacrifice, but he wrote a letter on April 28th to his wife that she wouldn't have received until after he probably died in the battle. And in that letter, it's almost like a premonition. He talks about how nervous he's nervous for the battle, and he knows it's going to be a big battle. And they're moving troops around, and it's everybody's kind of on edge. And his last words in that letter are really powerful. He said, my dearest wife, I love you. I hope I make it. Don't forget about me, and don't forget about the children, and tell them not to forget about me. And that's the last thing he's ever going to send home. The next letter that his wife would receive is from the lieutenant saying, I'm sorry to inform you, but your husband has died in the Battle of Chancellorsville on May 3rd. And it's really sad. It's really a powerful moment that kind of illustrates that ultimate sacrifice. Like, could Crowther have gotten his guys out of there and survived? Maybe. Ultimately, the battle was a loss, but he did that to try to save as many guys as he could. and he wasn't going to put himself in a position where he ran away before, the rest of his men. So it was really sad.
Okay. Is there any myths or exaggerations about his story that you know of?
Yeah, so kind of one of the interesting bits of his story, after he dies, they had to leave his body behind, right? So the Union couldn't bring him. And they write letters home to his wife. His wife's first question is like, are you shipping him home? Are you shipping him on a train? Where's his stuff? Like, he had a trunk. He was a commander. He had a horse. He had a trunk. He had a sword. His uniform. His wife's like, I would like to have his personal effects. And they were like, well, unfortunately, it's behind Confederate lines, and we can't go get it. They won't sign off letting us to go get it. A lot of times after battles, Confederates and Union troops would, like, after the armories had left, the remaining troops would, like, agree and be like, okay, you can come over and get your people. We're going to go get our people so that we can send them home so they can go be buried in their cemeteries at their hometowns. Crowther's wife, Sarah, wants to know where his body is and all his stuff. And unfortunately, they're like, we don't. He's somewhere over there. He's somewhere in Chancellorsville, wherever the Confederates have just kind of buried everybody. They would just bury them all in a big mass grave. They just dig a big hole. And one cool part that we found was that when they actually are eventually allowed to go and try to dig up and find these bodies, because you can't just let them lay around, when they were allowed to go get them, the Confederates had buried Crowther because of his rank, and they knew who he was. They had like the little epithets on his shoulder. Because of his rank, they buried him in a grave by himself, and they marked it with like a cracker box. It said like James Crowther. They just set it on a cracker box, and then he was buried right there with all his stuff. So they left it. They didn't steal most of his things. They probably took some stuff, but they left most of it intact because he was an officer. All the other troops were fair game. Like, they would take their shoes all the time, or their coats or their pants. But they like buried Crowther in the special spot with a little box. And the kind of follow-up to that's kind of a crazy part of the story is his wife went around town in Tyrone and was like trying to plead with people, like, can somebody go get my husband's stuff? Someone go down to Maryland or Virginia or wherever it is and go get his stuff. I really want it back. And a guy in Tyrone named John Stewart, John D. Stewart, he opened the City Hotel in Tyrone. He's a kind of a big name in Tyrone history. He was like, I will do it. I'll go get your husband's stuff. It's a really honorable position. Crowther's kind of this famous guy. He was the mayor of Tyrone, right, when he left. He's no longer the mayor. So they were like, we'll do this for you, Sarah, because he's important. And Stewart went, and by most accounts, he got the stuff from Chancellorsville. And somewhere between Chancellorsville and Tyrone, what we think is in Harrisburg, he got off the train in Harrisburg for some reason, whether he was going to have a meeting or whether he was going to talk to somebody, and he left it on the train. And so to this day, we don't know where any of Crowther's stuff is. It's gone. So she never got any of it back. It's terrible because that stuff is really valuable. And like Sarah couldn't run the business. Sarah's son, Bill, the oldest son, he could run the business, but he enlisted like his dad in the Civil War. And in 1864, he's killed in battle. He was a member of the 2nd Pennsylvania Cavalry. So the one who could have taken over, who had been running the business while his dad was at war, he enlists and then dies a year later in a battle. And George, his second son, didn't really have that business acumen, really just kind of wasn't his forte. And so he didn't want anything to do with the business. And the little girl, Allie, she was too young. And so realistically what happened was once they couldn't get his stuff back, Sarah and the two remaining kids had to move because they couldn't afford to stay. She didn't remarry, and so she left. She couldn't even afford to bring his body back. That cost money, and she didn't have the money to bring him back without having his stuff. She could have sold some of his things to get his body back and bury him in Grandview, where the rest of their family's buried. But she couldn't get it because this guy lost the stuff. And you're thinking, like, well, what did John Stewart do? Did, like, people hate him? No, they were just like, it's a bummer. It's a really big historical bummer. because I'd really like to see that sword and all that stuff. It's really, really important. But yeah, it's just kind of a really like terrible ending to this true hero. Everybody thinks he's a hero. He's, combined this unit, made them a fighting force. They fight in the Battle of Chancellorsville heroically, right? He dies in heroic fashion as the last guy off of this retreat. And then a guy from Tyrone goes out to get his stuff and loses it all because he forgot it on a train, which is kind of a high stakes mistake. So that's like, people don't know the back end of that story. So even people who know who like James Crowther is, he's somewhat famous. If you ever go to Chancellorsville and you go to the battlefield, he is the highest ranking Union officer buried at Chancellorsville. And the reason he's buried there is, like I said, most likely his wife couldn't afford to get his body back to Tyrone. And so he was buried there. And even though he's a colonel, he's a really high ranking officer, his headstone is just like everybody else's, standard issue government headstone, the ones that they got for free. So it just says Colonel James Crowther. And it's right in the middle of the cemetery. So it's not even in like a big position of prominence or anything like that with a giant monument there. Nope, just a little headstone says James Crowther on it, because that's what was free.
Okay. How is this person remembered in Tyrone, or if they are remembered at all at this point?
So, good question. How is he remembered in Tyrone? So, a guy named Bob Heilman, who was a historian, wrote 2 books. So he got a collection of letters from the Crowthers. So, from the Crowther ancestors is a collection of letters. He compiles them into 2 books. Those books you can purchase in town, or you can purchase them online. But it's basically every letter that James Crowther wrote to his wife and every letter that he wrote to other folks as well. And so we have a pretty good idea of like his experience in the war. You get his opinions on stuff. It's really kind of neat. It's a rare thing to have. There's also some organizations that were created around it, like kind of like a James Crowther Society that were created around this and you can look them up on Facebook and social media. That were created to kind of celebrate his life and try to remember him. But I always say, like, if you were going to build a statue in Tyrone and you wanted someone that like wasn't controversial in any way, James Crowther's probably the guy, right? Civil War hero, died protecting our country. Like, I don't think anybody could really complain if you were like, let's build a statue of that guy. But honestly, I mean, aside from these stories, those books, and then like me telling people, because it's like one of my favorite stories, unfortunately we don't have much to remember him, because he's not buried in Grandview. If he was buried up in Grandview, you'd probably have like, a special marker by his grave, but he's buried in Chancellorsville. So yeah, it's unfortunate that we don't do more to celebrate his life, but it's a really intense story, and I guess it helps me because I know the story and I get to tell people. And so I'm trying. We'll try to make sure that everyone knows who James Crowther is from now on. Yes, with this new media, I'll sure help.
Anything else you want to add about him, or?
So the only thing that I would add, I mean, aside from, he's absolutely an epic hero, incredible story, really sad ending to the story. The war, at the end of Chancellorsville, the thing that we oftentimes overlook is like when you hear these really interesting stories about Civil War generals or these battles or these guys who pass away or who sacrifice everything, we don't necessarily think like what happens next, right? The Civil War didn't end at Chancellorsville, right? The South wins that battle, and the war 2 months later is going to be like the biggest battle in the whole thing, right? So Gettysburg is 2 months later. The 110th Pennsylvania has to reorganize and then go fight at Gettysburg. And so they're there in a really like crazy spot in Gettysburg. And the guy who takes command from James Crowther dies. The guy who gets command of the 110th after that is also from Tyrone. His name's David Jones. And he's going to command at Gettysburg, and he's going to be wounded at Gettysburg. He's going to lose a leg and have to come home. And so the war continues, right? So even though everybody is like, oh, that's sad, and for the Crowthers, that part of the war was over. But remember, he had a younger son who was still fighting, in the 2nd PA Cavalry. And so the wife, Sarah, was probably just sitting there like, I want my son to come home, but he enlisted, right? And so he has to keep fighting. So this war is going to go on 2 more years after Chancellorsville. It's not going to end until 1865. And so, you know, it's important to like put it into context and think about like his story is really powerful, but it's not unique. You know what I mean? That happened a lot to a lot of different units. And if you do your family history and people are really engaged in genealogy and stuff like that, everyone has someone in their family who either fought or was related to the fight in some way, and is related to stories like this, like Crowther's story. And the war goes on and on and on. And so it's important to just think about it in context and think about that sacrifice that he made, and try to do our best to remember him. So we're going to make everybody listen to this podcast so that everybody knows who James Crowther is, so that we can all rest easy.
Okay, that's all we got for this episode. Have a nice day.